In this episode, we're going to tackle one of the most tempting and one of the most risky habits in threat analysis, which is the urge to name who did it before the evidence can truly support that claim. Attribution feels satisfying because it creates closure, and closure feels like control when an intrusion has made everything feel uncertain. Beginners also see attribution used in headlines and reports, which can make it seem like the main point of intelligence work is to attach a name to an attack. The reality is that attribution is a tool, and like any tool, it can help or harm depending on how it is used. When attribution is done carefully, it can inform long-term strategy, partnerships, and priorities, but when it is done carelessly, it can damage credibility, create political risk, and distract defenders from what actually needs to be fixed. The goal here is to learn how to weigh the trade-offs and avoid overreach, so your conclusions remain useful and defensible. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Attribution, at its core, means connecting observed activity to an actor, and that actor might be described at different levels depending on what you can support. Sometimes attribution means naming a specific intrusion set. Sometimes it means linking activity to an organization, and sometimes it is limited to describing a cluster of related operations without claiming a true identity. This matters because beginners often treat attribution as an all-or-nothing statement, as if the only options are to name a group confidently or to say nothing at all. In practice, attribution can be a spectrum, ranging from a simple claim that two incidents are related to a more complex claim about who controls the infrastructure and why they are acting. The more specific you are, the stronger the evidence must be, because specificity increases the cost of being wrong. If you keep this spectrum in mind, you can still provide meaningful analysis without forcing a final name prematurely. A disciplined analyst treats attribution as a layered conclusion that can become more precise only as evidence becomes stronger. One reason attribution is difficult is that it is not just a technical question, even though it often starts with technical clues. Many of the data points defenders see are artifacts of tools and infrastructure, such as network destinations, malware behaviors, and authentication events. Those clues can tell you what happened and how it happened, but translating them into who did it requires an additional step that is inherently uncertain. Attackers can share tools, buy access, reuse leaked code, and borrow techniques, so the same capability can appear in unrelated operations. Attackers can also compromise infrastructure that was previously used by another actor, which creates confusing overlaps that look like linkage when there may be none. This means a purely technical match, like a similar payload or a similar domain pattern, can be useful for detection but weak for identity claims. Attribution is hard because the adversary benefits when you draw the wrong conclusion, and they will sometimes shape evidence to encourage that mistake. A key trade-off to understand is that attribution can be strategically valuable while still being operationally unnecessary in many response situations. If your immediate goal is to contain an intrusion, restore safe operations, and prevent recurrence, then the most important questions are about access paths, persistence, lateral movement, and impact. Knowing the actor name rarely changes the first wave of defensive actions, especially when those actions are behavior-driven and focused on shutting down risk. However, attribution can matter for long-term decisions, such as which threats to prioritize, which partnerships to pursue, or which sectors and assets might be targeted next. The trade-off is that pursuing attribution during an active incident can consume time and attention that might be better spent on scoping and containment. It can also push analysts toward premature conclusions because leadership often wants a simple answer quickly. A mature approach is to separate operational response needs from strategic intelligence needs and to avoid letting the desire for a name distort urgent defensive work. Another trade-off is that attribution claims can be persuasive in ways that exceed the evidence, which is exactly why they are dangerous when made casually. People naturally trust confident stories, and a named adversary feels like a complete story even when the underlying case is thin. This is why overreach is not only a technical problem, but a communication problem, because once a name is attached, it becomes sticky in people's minds. If you later correct the conclusion, the correction may not travel as far or as fast as the original claim, and the organization may keep acting as if the initial attribution is still true. Overreach can also create pressure to defend the claim rather than to test it, which turns analysis into a reputation protection exercise. This is especially harmful in environments where multiple teams must coordinate, because one overconfident attribution can cause everyone to focus on the wrong threat model. Avoiding overreach is a credibility shield that protects the team's ability to adjust as new evidence arrives. To weigh attribution responsibly, it helps to know the types of evidence people commonly use and why those evidence types differ in strength. Some evidence is direct and rare, such as a reliable linkage between operator identity and operational infrastructure, but defenders in most organizations rarely have access to truly direct evidence. More commonly, analysts rely on patterns, such as consistent behavior sequences, distinctive capability traits, and repeated operational habits. These patterns can create a strong case that activity belongs to the same cluster, even if the true identity of the actor remains unknown. Infrastructure overlap can strengthen a case when it is distinctive and repeated, but it can also be misleading when infrastructure is widely shared or frequently compromised. Malware code similarities can be meaningful when they reflect unique implementation choices, but they can be less meaningful when they reflect common toolkits. A disciplined analyst treats each evidence type as a piece of a case, not as a single proof, and avoids building identity claims on evidence that is easy to fake or commonly shared. A beginner misunderstanding that often leads to overreach is the assumption that malware family names equal actor identity, as if a label on a sample points directly to who is behind it. Malware is a tool, and tools move between hands, especially in an ecosystem where code is reused, sold, leaked, or repackaged. Even when a malware family is strongly associated with a particular actor historically, that association can weaken over time as the tool becomes more broadly available or as others mimic it intentionally. The more public a tool or technique becomes, the less it should be treated as identity evidence. This does not mean malware analysis is useless for attribution, because distinctive implementation choices can still matter, but it does mean you should resist the urge to treat a family label as a name tag. A safer habit is to treat malware family as a capability clue that helps you understand behavior, while treating actor identity as a separate question that requires additional, independent support. When you separate tool from operator, your conclusions become steadier under scrutiny. False flags and mimicry are another reason attribution is risky, and it is important to understand them without sliding into paranoia. A false flag is when an adversary intentionally plants clues that suggest another actor, hoping defenders will blame the wrong party or waste time. Mimicry can be less intentional and still confusing, such as when multiple actors follow similar public playbooks or copy techniques described in widely available write-ups. The practical implication is that some evidence is easier to manipulate than people realize, especially superficial artifacts and visible strings that can be placed deliberately. More subtle clues, like long-term operational habits and consistent procedure-level behaviors, are harder to fake convincingly over many events. This is why attribution should rarely rest on a single artifact and why long-term pattern analysis is often more reliable than short-term indicator matching. The goal is not to assume deception everywhere, but to build conclusions that remain credible even if some clues were planted or borrowed. Because attribution is often requested by leaders, part of avoiding overreach is learning how to answer the question responsibly without sounding evasive. Leaders may ask who did this because they want to understand risk, liability, and response posture, not because they personally care about adversary branding. A useful response explains what you can support, what you cannot yet support, and why it matters for decision-making. You can communicate that the evidence supports a linkage to a cluster of activity with specific behaviors, and that the confidence level for any specific identity claim is limited at this time. You can also redirect toward what is known to be operationally relevant, such as how access was gained and what the adversary attempted. This approach respects the leader's need for clarity while protecting them from acting on an identity claim that could be wrong. Avoiding overreach does not mean refusing to answer. It means answering in a way that is aligned to evidence and outcomes. It is also important to understand that attribution can carry consequences outside the security team, which raises the cost of error. Incorrect attribution can affect legal decisions, such as whether to pursue certain actions or how to phrase formal notifications. It can affect public communication because statements about who did something can create reputational risk and can trigger questions from customers, partners, or regulators. It can affect relationships because partners may treat attribution claims as sensitive and may base trust on how responsibly those claims are handled. Even internally, incorrect attribution can create political friction, especially if it implies motives or capabilities that do not match reality. These consequences do not mean attribution should never be attempted, but they do mean the burden of proof should rise as the consequence rises. A beginner-friendly rule is that the more irreversible the downstream decision, the more cautious the attribution statement should be. When you weigh trade-offs, you are weighing not only analysis pride, but real-world impact. Another trade-off worth learning early is the difference between attribution for understanding and attribution for action, because the two have different evidence thresholds. Attribution for understanding is about building a threat picture over time, identifying recurring patterns, and improving strategic awareness. Attribution for action is about making immediate choices, like whether to shut down a system, notify a partner, or alter business operations. Action-focused decisions often do not need a named actor, but they do need clarity about capabilities, access, and intent. Understanding-focused work can tolerate more uncertainty because it evolves over time and is refined as new signals arrive. If you confuse these two purposes, you may push for a named actor during a time-sensitive response when it adds little operational value, or you may avoid all attribution even when long-term strategic planning would benefit from a careful linkage model. Keeping the purpose clear helps you avoid overreach because it prevents you from doing high-risk claims when the payoff is small. The best analysts match attribution effort and attribution specificity to the decision it is meant to support. To avoid overreach in practice, you need a habit of explicitly stating what assumptions your attribution depends on, even if you never use the word assumption in your final messaging. For example, if your linkage depends on infrastructure overlap, you should be aware of whether that infrastructure could be shared or compromised by others. If your linkage depends on code similarity, you should be aware of whether the code is common in public toolkits or rare in its implementation choices. If your linkage depends on timing patterns, you should consider whether those patterns could reflect automation rather than a human operator's work window. This self-checking is a form of pressure testing applied specifically to attribution. It keeps you from treating a plausible story as a proven story. Over time, this habit makes your analysis more resilient because you are always aware of what could break your conclusion if new evidence arrives. A related skill is knowing how to preserve the value of attribution work even when you cannot finalize identity, because beginners sometimes feel that incomplete attribution equals failure. If you can link incidents into a coherent cluster based on repeated capability and procedure-level behaviors, you have created something operationally valuable even without a true name. That cluster can drive better detection priorities, better hunting hypotheses, and better anticipation of likely next steps. It can also help you communicate to leadership that this activity is consistent with a recurring threat pattern, which supports investment and prioritization decisions without needing a headline label. In many organizations, the most practical product is not a definitive identity claim, but a defensible description of a recurring intrusion pattern that defenders can recognize quickly. This is the heart of restraint because it values usefulness over drama. When you build confidence in cluster-level analysis, you stop feeling pressure to overreach just to sound definitive. Finally, it helps to remember that attribution is not a one-time announcement, but an evolving judgment that should become sharper as evidence grows, and that evolution should be treated as normal rather than embarrassing. Early in an investigation, you may have only weak signals that suggest a possible linkage, and it is appropriate to treat that as tentative. As more evidence arrives, you may move from tentative linkage to stronger linkage, or you may decide the initial hypothesis was wrong and revise your view. The most professional posture is to treat updates as the natural result of better data, not as a reversal to hide. This is why restraint actually strengthens trust. because it gives you room to adapt without damaging credibility. Leaders can accept uncertainty when it is communicated clearly and when it is paired with decisive operational guidance. Overreach removes that flexibility and creates pressure to defend claims even when the evidence shifts. As we wrap up, weighing attribution trade-offs and avoiding overreach is really about protecting two things at once: the quality of your analysis and the quality of the decisions that depend on it. Attribution can be valuable, especially for long-term understanding, but it is often unnecessary for immediate response actions that focus on access paths, behaviors, and risk reduction. The evidence behind attribution is frequently indirect and vulnerable to sharing, mimicry, and manipulation, which means identity claims should be calibrated to the strength and uniqueness of the supporting case. Overreach is costly because names stick, consequences can be legal and reputational, and incorrect claims can distract defenders from what actually needs to change. A disciplined approach focuses on cluster-level patterns when identity is uncertain, communicates what is known and unknown in a clear way, and treats attribution as an evolving judgment rather than a dramatic finish line. If you build this restraint now, you will produce intelligence that leaders can trust, defenders can use, and your future self will not have to walk back under pressure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.